I'm not getting the same amount of work done. I've got my dog at my side. I've got 2 cats roaming the house. All of the interruptions and all of the inefficiencies of working at home. It's great to have the opportunity to work at home, but we are not, at this point, those that are not accustomed to it are not nearly as efficient at home. I've made some pretty bold statements about 6 weeks ago when this really started to surface as an incredibly sharp contraction in economic activity, that we could see the state unemployment rate rise above 30%. I still think that's possible. I don't think it will stay at that level for a long period of time. But I was criticized for that particular forecast, as it perceived by many as being too dire. I will note that the St. Louis Federal Reserve Bank has also suggested the unemployment rate could rise above 30%. The monthly rate, I don't think the unemployment rate will be sustained at that level, but it will potentially get to that level. It's very easy to see the unemployment rate rising above 20%. Here's a scenario. Let's assume that 80% of your jobs in leisure and hospitality services are lost. About half of the jobs in retail trade are lost, and about 20% of our jobs in Tennessee in manufacturing lost. That's just 3 sectors. That hit to the economy alone pushes the state unemployment rate to around 23%. And we know that every sector of the economy, even the healthcare sector, has been hit. The hospitals and doctors' offices and dentist offices around the country, the latter being closed, the hospitals not doing elective surgery, there are layoffs in the healthcare sector. So again, very easy to get to a 30% unemployment rate. The labor market, I don't think is going to see a quick rebound. And I'll return to that here a little bit later, but I expect the levels of employment not to be restored until 2022 or 2023. Now, we may see some very strong monthly or quarterly job gains, but those are going to be on the heels of an absolute collapse of the national and the state labor market. So if you have a 30% increase in unemployment, it can take, you can see a 5% gain in jobs on a quarter-to-quarter basis. It still takes quite a time to get back to where we were before the pandemic hit the economy. So I see ongoing pain in the labor market for a very, very long time to come. I've already noted that virtually every sector of the economy is going to get hit by this. It is being hit right now. I named leisure and hospitality and eating and drinking establishments. Those are places that are very, very visible, but virtually every sector of our state economy is being hampered by the coronavirus and its consequences. The economic burden is this, it may come as a surprise, and again, I don't have the data yet to back this up, but I am betting that the economic hardship will be much worse in urban Tennessee. See that slip there? I'm accustomed to saying that economic conditions are more dire in rural America and rural Tennessee. That remains the case. However, rural Tennessee and rural America does not have the strong, diverse employment base, typically strong and diverse employment base that the metropolitan areas have. They're being decimated. A rather odd statement I will make, but by virtue of the fact that rural economies are very narrow and they don't have much of an economic base, they don't have a lot to lose. They have not experienced the same degree of social distancing that the metropolitan areas have confronted. So they are going to be hit. Rural Tennessee, rural America will be hit by this. But when we look at the data, I'm betting that we find that it is urban Tennessee that is hit the hardest. This is going to have serious consequences for government finances at the federal level, but in particular at the local level and the state level across the country and here in Tennessee. The good news is that it hit at the close, near the close of a fiscal year. So as fiscal year 2020 comes to a close, the local governments around the country and around Tennessee are in decent shape, if for no other reason than they've already collected a huge share of their fiscal year revenue, and they've already collected most of the property taxes that they were going to collect. Many people pay their property taxes in advance, and those property taxes are in the coffers of local governments here in Tennessee. Now, going forward, what it means is the start to fiscal year 2021 is going to start in a trough. Budgets, the revenue side of local government budgets, the revenue side of the state budget is going to operate from the beginning of the next fiscal year in a very, very deep hole. Sales taxes, sales tax revenue collapsing, probably falling in the second quarter by 20 to 25%, maybe a bit more than that. People are not going to the stores. They're not buying, importantly, big ticket items like automobiles, furniture, fixture, major appliances, and so on. We're buying a lot online. We're still going to the grocery stores because we have to, but we're not buying a lot of other things for the households for ourselves. So sales tax revenues are going to take a hit. And those sales tax revenues will be buoyed by federal transfers, unemployment insurance, and so on. But the hit to income, the hit to confidence, the hit to wealth through the decline in the stock market, and importantly, the decline in business-to-business activity will contribute to a very weak sales tax outlook as we go into the next year. Let me clarify something I just said, business-to-business transactions. Most folks are not aware of the fact that about a third of the revenue that we get from the sales tax at the state and local level, it comes from the sales tax being applied to business transactions. So for example, while the goods at Walmart or Target are not subject to tax when they are purchased at the wholesale level, virtually everything else in those stores is subject to sales tax. The carts, the office equipment, the flooring, the shelving, the very brick and mortar that houses those retail establishments, that brick and mortar was subject to sales tax as well. So with diminished business activity, what that means is diminished sales tax revenues. Not a hit to an income tax in Tennessee because we don't have a broad-based income tax. There's a question on the list. I'll go ahead and head that off right now. Would Tennessee have been better or worse from a fiscal perspective with an income tax? I think we would have been marginally better with the income tax. In part, that is based upon my guess that the incidence of the layoffs and so on has been predominantly on the part of low-income workers. Many higher income workers are still on the job. They're working remotely or they're still working at their place of work. Low income workers oftentimes don't even pay income tax once they have deductions, exemptions, and so on. So I think we would have been marginally better off with an income tax, but it would not have been any kind of a salvation for us. So what's the outlook? Well, the outlook, since this is a public health related economic downturn, is going to depend upon how public health evolves over the next couple of months. My guess is that we're going to see a hockey stick shaped recovery, the sharp decline for the end of the hockey stick, and then this slow recovery, as I noted, until levels of economic activity are restored in 2021, 2022, or 2023. There was initially talk about the possibility of a V-shaped recovery. I see that as just inconceivable for a number of reasons. First of all, the global economy is still being battered by this. This means that our interaction with the international sector of the global economy is going to be weakened. As some states like New York recover out of the depths of the coronavirus problem, there are going to be other states that have a problem. A lot of our trade in the United States is interstate trade. Insofar as we have weak states among the 50 states, that will hamper a recovery. It will be very slow for businesses that deal with human-to-human contact to open soon. And we're already seeing that with restaurants and other establishments where we have to engage in social distancing, wear masks, and so on. So I think this is going to be a very slow recovery. I mentioned early, it could be a W-shaped recovery. We could go through a period in the third quarter, that's the summer of this year. We could see some improving economic conditions, but if there's another wave, a second wave of coronavirus in the fall, if that were to lead to policies that were harsh and cause people to stay at home, then we could very, very possibly see a double dip kind of economic downturn. And I want to note here that a lot of the social distancing that we observe around the country, states have gotten a lot of criticism from some circles for the stay-at-home policies that they have advocated. But do note, and I think the history will show this, the ex post history, that the American people social distanced without public policy. There's anecdotal evidence, and I think the evidence is going to mount that before the states, before local governments enacted policies, people were already becoming more cautious. And that has probably been very instrumental in bringing the toll of the coronavirus down. There's also, that one more comment about the economic recovery. I think about my son, who is a cook at a restaurant down by campus. He's on unemployment insurance right now, doesn't know when he's going to come back. Me, on the other hand, I've been working. My wife works at Fort Sanders. She continues to work. We continue to get the same paycheck that we have been getting for the last many, many months. When we come out of this, I'm going to be in a position, my wife and I will be in a position to spend money and return to normal. My son won't. He will be behind on a car payment, behind on a house payment. He will have drained some of his savings, and it will be very difficult for him to recover. So there will be two types of people when we see the rebound of this recovery. And then a big question that folks are now answering or trying to answer, and that is, what does the post-COVID-19 economy look like? We know there's going to be less travel, but for how long? We know people are going to engage in greater remote working, buying from home and so on. What does that do to the retail market and sales tax revenues? There's been talk about onshoring things that have been produced offshore, things in China. That could be personal protective equipment. It could be just widgets for the production process. Well, there's a reason that that production activity is taking place now in China. It's cheaper. If we bring it back home, it's going to be more expensive. All types of events that have people coming together, from tailgating for a football game to a high school concert, you name it, those sorts of events. Our downtown farmers market in Knoxville, those activities will be impacted. Social distancing on production lines, social distancing at factories around the state, around the country, is going to change the way of doing business and in all likelihood raise costs. I think there's also the question is, we are a divided American society right now. We are divided by virtue of self-selection into our internet site of our preference, the news that satisfies our preference and intuition. And if we have less social interaction, I gravely fear that we will become a more divided society still when this is all said and done. So a couple more comments here, and I'll open it up for questions. The federal government has implemented both fiscal policy and monetary policy to try to temper the blow of the coronavirus. The fiscal policy has oftentimes been referred to as a stimulus package. It's not a stimulus package. It's a liquidity package. It's intended to give households and businesses the financial wherewithal to avoid bankruptcy and continue to pay their bills, to pay their rent, to pay their mortgage, to pay their car payment, pay their phone bill, keep up on their credit cards, and so on. An incredibly expensive proposition that will not have the same effect as the same sort of stimulus would have in prior recessions, because we do not have the opportunity today to go out and spend, and there is tremendous anxiety still in society and in the economy today about the path of the economy and our health, our own health, our family's health, and our public health. The Federal Reserve has very limited capacity. I'm one of those folks that has for quite some time, for many years, been saying that we're in trouble from a monetary policy perspective if we have a recession, because the Federal Reserve does not have the capacity now to do much to combat an economic downturn. Interest rates are already incredibly low, and there's very little that the Fed can do right now. And you know, if interest rates are zero, that's not going to change a lot of people's decision about buying a car, buying a home, and so on. Interest rates could go into the negative range. I think that's unlikely. It's unprecedented, but it's entirely possible. Understand that the Federal Reserve is not leading monetary policy in the US or in the global economy today. The Federal Reserve is in some ways reacting to the global trend towards lower interest rates and the phenomenon that goes back to the middle of the Great Recession, some 10 years ago, where the Federal Reserve banks around the country, monetary authorities around the country, were trying to inject stimulus into the economy. That hadn't ended when the COVID-19 plague, if you will, hit our economy. Last, I want to talk about something that folks tend to find very, very distasteful, and that is this comparison of the trade-off between the economy and life and death. So about 6 weeks ago, I'm guessing it was, I posted something on our website, .utk.edu. And I did a very simple back of the envelope cost benefit calculation, and looking at the value of life versus the consequences of closing down the economy. One of the most controversial things that I did in that, but it's in fact not so controversial, is I used a figure for the value of a human life of $10 million. That's a figure that comes from the Environmental Protection Agency. It's a figure that is used roundly in doing cost-benefit analysis as related to government regulations and government policy. So a government policy that would tighten methane restrictions, for example, if that methane restriction leads to the saving of an American life, you want to be able to place a value on it. And the average value is about $10 million. It's been frustrating, exasperating at times, addressing people's concerns about that particular approach. Folks, that's what we do. As I just noted, that's how we evaluate the cost-benefit test for a federal government regulation. It's a very standard thing to do. Now, if you don't like the $10 million figure, then what do? How do you guide policy? How do you weigh, what do you weigh against the economic downturn that we're seeing right now? So it may not be a perfect measure. It's an average measure. It's not a measure of the value of a life for a child. It's not the measure of a value of life for a 77-year-old. It's not the value of life for your grandmother or your grandchild. It's an average value. So why don't we do this? Why don't we calculate this value of a life by age? We can. We can do it. There was actually a wonderful analysis done, I think it was on Marketplace on NPR about a week ago, where they talked about why we don't do that. I personally don't want to get into a situation where we could have a cost-benefit analysis test and we could say, well, this one just kills a bunch of children, or this one just kills a bunch of old people, and therefore the policy is justified or not justified. That is very, very distasteful. I don't want society and policymakers general that engage in these kinds of policies and do this kind of work don't want to go there either. So the $10 million figure is in fact an average. You can go out and find evidence on the value of a statistical life. It's pretty robust information and evidence out there, and you'll see in fact that the estimates all generally vary by age. One of the questions that Wolf sent to me was about that value of a statistical life. I personally don't think it's biased. It's generally not based on a self-assessed value of life. So if you ask me what my life is worth, or what my child is worth, or my wife is worth, and I have no capacity to actually make that payment, then it's really irrelevant. This is a problem that we have in evaluating the spotted owl or a rare wolf or global warming. What's it worth? So economists look at what people choose to do. We look at the kind of car you buy and the kind of safety equipment that's on that car. We look at jobs that are risky, jobs that may cost someone their life. And so it's based on what economists call revealed preference. And that's where the best estimates of a value of the statistical life comes from. One of my mantras to students as an economist, I do not believe what people say. I don't believe it. What I believe is what people do. It's what they do that's an actual actionable reflection of their underlying sentiment. So the punchline for my analysis was, assuming roughly a 30% hit to our state GDP, and in fact, forecasters around the nation are calling for such for the second quarter for the national economy. If we saved 10,000 lives in Tennessee, then the policy would be justified. Now, I've had some folks email me and send me notes saying, Dr. Murray, we haven't had 10,000 people die. That's right. We didn't have 500,000 American troops die invading Japan either, okay? So folks have contacted me to tell me that the fact that we haven't had significant loss of life means that the policies are unjustified. That's wholly unsatisfactory. I will not engage in such a logic. We dropped the atom bomb on Japan to save 500,000 American troops. 500,000 American troops did not die because we did not have to invade Japan. We did not see 10,000 Tennesseans die because social distancing exercised by individuals and the policies enacted by state and local communities across the state helped us beat back the virus. So that's all I have to say in terms of my somewhat planned remarks. I'd be happy to answer any questions you folks have, or I can turn to the questions that Wolf has sent to me.
Everybody is muted. If you have a question that you would like to ask, if you will press down your space key, you should be able to ask it. Daryl, would you try that to see if that works? I take it that doesn't work. I will, I don't know, I tell you what, right now, since people did send you questions, let's go through those questions first. They took the trouble to send you a question. I think they should be answered.
All right, very good. Question about basic income. Punchline, would it have blunted the socioeconomic impact of COVID-19? Absolutely, it would have blunted the impact. It would have been a very significant means of supporting the liquidity of households, allowing their spending, particularly on I have some interest in universal basic income. I think it's a conversation that we ought to have in society. I don't think we're there yet. I think one of the most vexing questions is if we were to provide Americans with a check of $10,000, $15,000, or $20,000, what do we do with the whole array of social programs that we have in place right now? Medicaid, or even the Social Security system. We can't easily afford just now starting to write checks to everyone, so something has to give, and that means something on the expenditure side of the budget has to go away. And as soon as we have that conversation, somebody is pinpointed as a loser and they fight back. I think we're probably all, if manna from heaven was $15,000 a year and free money, we'd all take it. It's not free money. It has to come from someplace. So in principle, I like the idea for COVID-19, but also as the economy changes and we have concerns about mechanization, automation that puts people out of work, I think it's something that we ought to study further. I don't think society's ready for it, and I don't think we have enough information to act just yet. What kind of state and federal policies might reduce the economic impact of a possible future pandemic? I would just take off pandemic, a future calamity, a future catastrophe. This is a smart group I'm talking to. I'm sure many of you have heard about electromagnetic pulse and how something like that could have devastating consequences, could kill tens of millions of people, could destroy society as we know it right now. You know, we're not real good from an individual perspective or a societal perspective in ensuring against low probability but catastrophic events. So we can't insure against every pandemic. We can't insure against an electromagnetic pulse. What we can do, though, is we can take some preventative steps. So one thing, we need to have a bigger rainy day fund of some kind. Well, we need a rainy day fund at the federal government level. The ability to finance the deficit, we see now the difficulties that we're going to encounter if we have one or two more waves of federal government deficit spending. The state has a very substantial rainy day fund. We didn't use it during the Great Recession. Many states, Texas a good example, just sat on that rainy day fund, which was very unfortunate. But rainy day funds are just that. They're funds available for a rainy day. I'm concerned that something like that would be subject to political manipulation, but at least in principle, on paper, it would be a very significant step towards giving our state government, already has a rainy day fund, it should be bigger, but giving the federal government a means of stepping right in. All right, so There was a question about zero or negative interest rates. I somewhat addressed that. That's really all of the questions that I have here on the list. There's a chat question out there. I'm going to have to read it here slowly, and then I'm happy to respond. Yeah, I think you know, what do you see as the part of normal behavior which will be the most difficult to recover? I just think all of these things, anything that require, or anything where we have close person-to-person contact, birthday party. I had neighbors across the street with a funeral event this weekend, and there were probably 20 cars there. What do you do for a funeral? What do you do for a wedding? What do you do for a bar mitzvah? What do you do for things like this? We've never dealt with this in our lifetime. I'm looking out there. There's some older, there's some younger. I don't think any of us have ever had to deal with anything like this before. There are things like the subways that are referenced here in the note, or buses and that sort of thing. Those are essential for us to be able to work and to commute and to shop and so on. Now in Knoxville, we're a different kind of a community, as you know, but in major metros, the mass transit is absolutely essential, in part because you don't have driving options. So I don't know exactly what we're going to do, but everything, folks, is going to be harder. Everything is going to be more expensive as we go forward.
All right, I've corrected the mute, unmute. Daryl, would you try unmuting by pressing your space key?
Yeah, it works, Steve. Yeah, it worked for me this time.
If anybody has any questions, if you will press your space key, you can ask them of Dr. Murray.
Or the cat, Steve. I'm welcome to put the cat on the spot here.
Oh, I have a question.
Yes, sir.
There's been a lot of anecdotal evidence about the change in the environment as the result of this. And I'm curious to know where that might lead down the road in terms of the economic issues that come up with the fact that clean air, clean water is a health benefit. What do you think about that? I mean, just in general terms from an economic standpoint.
Bruce, I don't have a good answer in terms of the economics of this. It's too early. What I will say is that folks in communities where they see that blue sky, where they see the clear air, or at least they don't see the particulate and the other things in the air, this has to be a real awakening, because for many people, depending on where you live, many people, Southern California, for example, you never see the clear skies other than after a rain. So this could, in fact, be very good long-term for the environment by increasing people's awareness of how society is doing damage to the same environment.
This is Ev. I have a question. Even before the coronavirus started up, there was a lot of concern that artificial intelligence and autonomous driving was going to have a major impact on the jobs available to people without higher education, and that the split or the concentration of wealth was going to be becoming even more severe. It seems to me that the coronavirus is just going to accelerate that even more. Do you see a way out, or how? Or at what point is this just going to explode into a huge societal issue that there's 20% of the society is living reasonably well, and the 80% becomes an underclass?
Yeah, I have to say, and I can tell from the heads bobbing out there and so on, I'm not convinced that that's necessarily the case. I'm an amateur student of history, an amateur student of economic history, and there have been concerns about the displacement of workers in the workplace, the displacement of low-income workers in the workplace in particular, literally for centuries. As an economist, what happens when you have something that saves cost and saves money from a business perspective, it's not as if that saved income, that saved cost doesn't go anywhere. It ends up being plowed back into the economy. So I'm not as concerned long term about the loss of jobs. Having said that, I don't want to just sit by and wait for it to happen. So on my entire career, I have argued aggressively for investments in people, investments in human capital to make them more productive and make them more competitive. That's one thing that we can do to try to help those that are at the bottom end of the skill scale and the bottom end of the wage scale. There are a good number of economists out there that would agree with me that what you get with automation and so on is the substitution from labor to capital, but what you also get is what we call an output effect. It allows you to produce more. By virtue of producing more, there are more jobs for everyone. So I'm not sure if I'm in a minority or not amongst economists, but we have had these long-standing concerns about the evaporation of jobs. You can think about the knitting mills in the Northeast, many, many years ago, or any of those kinds of shocks that have gone through the economy. We create hardship, dire hardship, but then we then respond. And I'll finish with this. I have my colleague Bill Fox at UT, economist. I've worked for him at the Boyd Center for many, many years. He is absolutely convinced that autonomous vehicles are going to destroy the transportation equipment market, destroy the jobs in Tennessee, and it will have dire economic consequences for our overall economy. And I'm just not convinced. I think autonomous vehicles will arrive someday, but if we end up saving money by not owning a car, what are we going to do with it? My guess is that good Americans spend it. And so we don't spend it on a car that we own and park in our garage. We spend it on something else. The something else, whatever it is, creates a job somewhere else. Okay, I don't need a garage anymore. Well, what do I do with the savings in my home? City of Knoxville may not need as many parking garages anymore. Well, they can take the revenue and they put it in some other part of the budget, or they can lower taxes. So I'm not convinced that's going to be the case. So Ev, I'll now give you a chance to tell me I'm full of horse fooey.
Problem is that even with the unemployment rate over 20%, there's still a lot of unfilled jobs for computer engineers and computer scientists. But it's not so easy to just say we're going to retrain restaurant servers and make them into computer engineers.
The evidence suggests, there's no evidence to suggest it does work. You're absolutely right. Well, this country is, in the 1960s, we embarked on a path of what were then called workforce development policies, things like the Comprehensive Employment Training Act, make work programs, training programs. There's very, very little evidence that they work. Now, if they worked as a transfer mechanism. They may not have worked in training workers, but they did work in transferring money, resources to those same households. But there's very little evidence that we can take these low-skilled workers and turn them around. And I think that's absolutely true. I've got a question here from somebody about the team at UT, the Core 19 group. It started about 2 months ago. I'm really proud at how quickly we responded, how quickly we were able to get a website up, how quickly we were able to start providing input and feedback to the public about the emerging pandemic. That at that time, it was just emerging. So we have a group of folks that includes experts in public health, epidemiology, public policy, economics, mathematics, biology. The steering committee is a group of just 6 of us, pretty tight group, a couple public health people, public policy, epidemiology. We have a vet on the team with us. And what we have sought to do is not answer questions from the public, although we will entertain them. We're really trying to focus our efforts on supporting public health experts, local government elected officials, local government officials, and folks in state government, elected and otherwise. We're trying to give them a Tennessee flavor to the advice, the data, the information, the lessons that are emerging nationally. If you want to know about the national and global pandemic, go to Johns Hopkins. Don't go to the Core 19 website. That's not the market we're trying to really fulfill. That's not the need we're trying to meet right now. So we have put together very early on, there were instructions on how to make a mask. Pretty old today, right? How to make a mask. But 2 months ago, it wasn't old. We had a brief that I put together, qualitative, there's some numbers there, but largely qualitative, looking at the economic slump and what that would mean for local government revenues. There's a brief out there about pets. Can pets get the virus? Do they convey the virus? The brief we had put out about 6 or 7 weeks ago said no. We now know that pets can get coronavirus. We don't know if it's transmitted from the pet to the human, but we know they can actually get that. So our real interest is trying to meet the needs of folks in government, elected and otherwise, that are trying to engage in best response in combating the pandemic.
Question. I have a question, Dr. Murray, regarding the emphasis on education in the state of Tennessee.
Yes, sir.
Should the emphasis be on improving college education for our citizens, or improving the education for trades and labor skills?
I think the answer is all of the above. We need to do a better job with K through 12 education, students and their reading ability and their reading comprehension. We need to have more people with a college degree. We need to have adults go back and get, they don't need a 4-year degree, and don't get a PhD in economics, okay? There are lots of good jobs out there in the trades, and that's an area that we should certainly focus on. You know, electricians, plumbers, HVAC work, and so on. Those are pretty darn good paying jobs right now. In fact, a job like that, and I'm not joking here, a job like that will pay more than a new PhD in sociology or political science. So there are really good opportunities out there, and they are across the continuum, but we need to be investing in pre-K education, K through 12 education, college education, adult education, retraining and re-education. Question here, Mark Cuban of the Dallas Mavericks. Basketball efforts will be played before cameras, not a stadium full of people. I don't know the size that the size of the economy, but you know it's getting pretty desperate when ESPN on a weekend is playing a rerun of a hamburger eating championship. All right. A real sign of desperation. Now, you know, Villanova, Georgetown basketball, coming out of Syracuse as I did, Big East, that was heyday time for, you know, basketball in the Big East. That's okay. You know, that rerun's okay. I do think, seriously, I think we're going to see many athletic events played to empty stadiums, to empty audiences. Now, you could argue that we have social distancing and we all sit 6 feet apart. Who's going to pay for the tickets? Who's going to be sitting in those seats 6 feet away from one another? I think that the people that could afford the tickets would make that a rather ugly venue for the camera to pan over, because it's not going to be the sort of thing that the average family will be able to afford. This is a great mystery, I think, of how we're going to be able to deal with mass events like that. Neyland Stadium with 103,000 people. Now with the recruiting the way it is, we've got some real optimism about the future of the team over the course of the next couple of years. Is that going to happen to an empty Neyland Stadium? It could in fact be the case. And that would be absolutely huge. For universities, it's a huge amount of revenue that comes in. Now, UT athletics is almost entirely self-financing, depending on how one wants to look at their budget. But there are revenues that go to the main campus. And so it can be a serious revenue hit, and it will be a serious revenue hit to universities, certainly over the course of the academic year 2021.
Do you feel comfortable discussing how the virus will affect, or the virus affecting whether we vote in person or vote absentee?
Yeah,
How that might affect the election or economics of the election?
Yeah, I'm gonna jump out of my econ hat here, and I'm gonna put my democracy hat on. I feel very, very strongly that voting should be made easy. I think we need to have responsible voting. I think we need to have IDs and checks and so on. But look, folks, you can buy a house online. You can deal with a massive estate online. You can buy and sell jewelry and boats and so on online. I have no problem with a system of online voting. I find it really arcane that we continue, of all of the things we do in our life, we continue to go to the polls and line up and queue up to vote. Now, in some ways, it's kind of quaint, it's kind of nice, it's a sign of our patriotism and so on. I'm not interested in symbolic patriotism. I'm interested in allowing the American people to vote. And as such, I would like to see a simplified system that would allow people to vote securely, safely, without actually going to the ballot box.
I think they estimate about 10% of those that could vote will vote in the August election.
Typical for an off-cycle election like that. Typical to have, maybe not 10%, but typical to have very, very low turnout.
Would having a negative poll tax basically cost you not to vote be doable or democratic?
Well, I have mixed feelings about that, Steve. I believe Australia has a system where you can pay a fee and not vote. I just think I just don't like that. Philosophically, I don't like that. We should vote because we choose to vote. We should vote because we feel part of a democratic system. I don't want carrots and sticks involved, personally. It's not an economics matter. Personally, I just don't want that in the way. As somebody, I'm an economist. I became an economist because I didn't want to run for public office, because history didn't pay enough. But I'm a broad social scientist. And I think that we should encourage everyone in American society to vote. It's inconceivable to me that we would want it any other way. Our voting should reflect the preferences of all Americans. And I get bewildered and confused when I hear arguments that are contrary to that. Voter fraud, show me the voter fraud. Show me the evidence. Show me the pervasive evidence, and you'll be hard pressed to do so. You can give me anecdotes, but anecdotes do not constitute hard, unequivocal evidence. And so I'm a absolutely supporter of mail-in voting or online voting. Again, it has to be secure, but I'm 100% in favor of that.
This is Ev. I got another question. It seems that for political reasons, China's back in the picture now. Now, whether they're really responsible or something is kind of, in my mind, beside the point is China's advanced economically, and maybe they haven't been fair in how they've done that. But the concern going forward, in my mind, is that they're graduating 10 times as many scientists and engineers as we are. They're investing a lot more in artificial intelligence and quantum computing and infrastructure than we are. And, we seem to be worrying about bringing back manufacturing of face masks to this country. And, China's, moving beyond manufacturing.
No, I would generally, Ev, I would agree with you on that. China is going to become, and it will become a larger global powerhouse. The same time that we in the United States, we're pulling back from the global community at the same time that China continues. It's not new. China continues to reach out throughout Africa and other places around the world. And so I would rather deal with China heads up. I would like to be able to compete with China. I don't want to close the door to China. I don't want to bring things back from China and have to pay more from them. I want to outcompete China. I want to outproduce China. I want to outinvest China. I don't want to blame China for anything. Look, China has done what China felt it needed to do. And they've broken some rules, they've bent rules and so on. That is to be expected when you're in the high stakes game of global development. But we ought to try to beat them at their game, not close the doors to China. Let's beat them at their own game.
I agree with that. It's sort of like trying to get, not compete against China, sort of like having a football team and only playing a college football team and only playing high school teams because you want to make sure you win all your games. And I believe that back in the 50s, people felt about Japan that it was cheap stuff, and we couldn't compete with that. But when they progressed economically, it got to be that they're pretty much like we are, and then it came the South Koreans, and then the Chinese and the Vietnamese, and I don't know how we're going to compete against the Indians, but I think that we do better when we have good competition.
Competition is good, and I think what we do, Steve, is one of the things we do is there are some things that can be done that produced, mass produced with, very significant labor component, and that's where a country like India, China, less and less, but Vietnam and so on. Let them produce those things that we call labor intensive. The U.S. ought to be producing capital intensive goods, by which I mean things that have a lot of machinery, equipment, ideas, technology, and so on behind the scenes. The U.S. has always had, in the last 100 years, we've had a bit of an advantage in the global community with the capital intensity of our production processes. That's where it needs to be. That's where the focus needs to be. I don't like the blame game that's going on right now. Even blaming China for the coronavirus. Okay, maybe it is from China, but I would rather deal with the consequences right now. Okay, so the plane crashes. We find that a plane has a faulty part, and we're preoccupied with finding the producer of the faulty part rather than dealing with the people that were injured by the plane. Let's deal with the problem at hand. Push China off to the side. And let's just compete against them and let's beat them. Folks, I've got another Zoom call coming up here on the hour. And so I'm going to have to break away and feed the dog, pet the cats, and then get back in front of this monitor.
Thank you so much, Dr. Murray. And we will go ahead and close this out. We will attempt to have another virtual meeting in June, if we can find a speaker that's willing to participate under these circumstances. And we hope to hear from you all again. We will be keeping you all informed. Thank you so much.
See you, everybody.
Bye.